Hello and thank you. We have quite a few visitors here today, so I'll briefly introduce myself. It's Casper Meyer. I'm teaching classical archaeology here as faculty at Bard Graduate Center. And to start off with, it's not normally a good idea for a host to try to anticipate the subject of a lecture too closely in an introduction. But on this occasion, I cannot avoid raising questions from the outset, which I expect to figure very prominently in the next hour. How can we give voice to the displaced without displacing their feelings with ours? How can we acknowledge appropriately BGC's presence in the ancestral homeland of the Lenni Lenape and recognize New York as a past and future home for indigenous people, as well as others subjected to forced border crossings and diasporas? Is an acknowledgement ever enough? In the coming hour, our speaker and BGC fellow Yannis Hamilakis will show that objects can acknowledge displacement in more evocative ways, and perhaps better than words ever can. Yannis Hamilakis is since 2016 Joukowsky Family Professor of Archaeology and Professor of Modern Greek Studies at Brown University. He has previously taught in the UK at the University of Southampton and the University of Lampeter. And he began his studies originally in Crete, but then moved on to Sheffield for his graduate work. Now, personally, I have a bit of a lopsided perspective of Yannis's diverse research. I met Yannis a while ago as a doctoral fellow at the Getty Research Institute when he was just finishing his Nation and its Ruins, published in 2007, a study of Greece's national imagination through the lens of archaeology. This was an immensely influential book, which garnered, amongst others, the Edmund Keeley Prize of Modern Greek Studies, and recovered the sometimes insular field of Greek archaeology for critical interdisciplinary debates on colonialism, indigeneity, and representation. I only later discovered his equally impressive earlier work on zoo archaeology and foodways in the prehistoric Aegean. And in this disciplinary capacity, he has and actually continues to be actively involved in fieldwork, directing archaeological and ethnographic projects at Kalaureia on Poros, and currently at Katroulou Magula, a Neolithic tell site in central Greece. And with the privilege of hindsight, it's clear how these seemingly disconnected strands of research in prehistoric and contemporary Greece converge in Yannis's enduring interest in the affective and sensorial dimensions of material culture, which is best known from his 2013 monograph on the archaeology and the census. But it's also prominent in the many edited volumes and articles on embodiment, archaeological photography, archaeological pedagogy, assemblage theory, and many other topics. I think just to mention, he's got books on the way on the social lives of ruins, archaeological ethnography of the Greek islands, and most recently, a side-by-side study of archaeology and nationalism in Greece and Israel, co-authored with Raphael Greenberg. Last but not least, the interest in sensorial experience also comes out in his current work on archaeologies of forced and undocumented migration. He originally edited a special issue on the subject in the Journal of Contemporary Archaeology in 2016, when Europe's migrant reception crisis was giving way to the reactionary political crisis we're still all too familiar with. The journal issue was then republished in 2018 as an expanded book entitled The New Nomadic Age, which was selected as one of the best books of the year by the Art Forum, and resulted, what we're going to hear today about, in the exhibition Transient Matter, which is currently on view at the Hafenreffer Museum of Anthropology at Brown University. And I think on that note, I hand over to Yannis.
Thank you very much, Casper, for the very kind introduction. I'm very, very glad to be with you virtually, and I'm really sorry that I'm not there physically in New York right now. a city I love dearly. I am going to talk to you about the exhibition, but before that, I'm going to say a few things about the project, because I think it is important for all of us to get a sense of, what is the actual research, intellectual, methodological, and practical background of the exhibition. Now, as Gaspar mentioned, I'm an archaeologist who works on Greek prehistory, but also on the critical histories and on the politics of archaeology. The entanglement of archaeology and of material culture with colonialism and nationalism is one of the main research themes in my own work. Another is the relationship between archaeological sites and monuments and the various communities. Now, in addition to the excavation site, to the ethnographic field site, the library, obviously, and the archive, the museum and the exhibition gallery have been added recently to the field sites I'm working with. First, in organizing and curating a series of photography exhibitions at Brown, and now in co-curating an exhibition which I'm going to be talking to you about. So let me just share my screen. And so the exhibition is called Transient Matter, Assemblages of Migration in the Mediterranean. As you can see, it's an exhibition that it is co-curated. So although I was a chief curator, and it is based on the project I've been doing on the island of Lesbos, it was the actual curating and the putting together was a team effort, and it is a team effort shared with Darcy Hackley, with Sherina Razek, and with Aisha Sanlé. So you can see them here. And although the exhibition opened in February last year and had to close for obvious reasons in March, it is now fully online, and you can actually go onto this link and explore it yourself. So you can actually get a good sense of what we did in the gallery. But this exhibition and the topic is not about us. It is about other people. It is about people on the move, the new nomads of our age. And it is about also a phenomenon that is redefining our era and our world, the phenomenon that, as Gaspar mentioned, I dare called it the new nomadic age. And we can talk about that term if you wish later. So the project is located, or it's situated, on the island of Lesbos, the border island of Lesbos. Lesbos, as you know, is an island that's very close to the Turkish coast. And it is actually has been at the center of migration for many, many years now. I'll talk a lot about that in a minute, but I want first to say why this project, why now, and how is it linked to my other work, my previous work. So working on nationhood and national imagination also involves working and thinking about borders and bordering practices. So I'm naturally attracted to the materiality of borderscapes. Also, I have felt that the archaeology of contemporary border crossing and migration challenges our archaeological understanding on matter and time. Issues such as the transience and nomadism of people and objects, the inherent instability and the drifting of material things, the process of ruination itself, and the rate of ruination. For example, the accelerated ruination I have encountered on Lesbos. The notion of condensed and portable materiality. For example, the condensed materiality embodied on the cell phone, which is one of the iconic objects, perhaps the hyper object in the context of migration. The materialization of borders that were previously only lines on the map. They're kind of the building of walls or fences, the concrete, physical, immense presence on the landscape today are some of the issues that can be rethought of through the lens of this phenomenon, the phenomenon of contemporary migration. How are these new phenomena then help us rethink archaeology and the nature and properties of material culture altogether? So these are some of the underlying assumptions and starting questions for my work. But the reasons were also ethical and political. The need to intervene in the present using the apparatus of archaeology and archaeological ethnography. The need to understand the phenomenon by addressing the neglected aspects of materiality and at the same time perform archaeology as witnessing and as care. As I said, this is a project of archaeological ethnography. So you want to say one word on what archaeological ethnography is, or at least how do I define it? So I define archaeological ethnography as a shared transcultural space of encounters between different disciplines, most notably social anthropology, social cultural anthropology, and archaeology. A third space, if you wish, a Terrainwerk where archaeology and sociocultural anthropology meet, but also scholars and various communities meet, interact, and learn from each other. It also involves hybrid methodologies, for example, conducting archaeological ethnography in an archaeological site or in a kind of location of monuments. But this is also a project of contemporary archaeology. Now this is now a well-known field, and it's actually been has been advanced significantly in the last 20 years, so I won't say much about it, but only one word in relation to definitions. Now, you may have in mind a common sense definition of archaeology as the specialist study of the past using its material traces. I would call this a modernist archaeology, and I prefer to adopt instead a broader definition which sees archaeology as the discourses and practices involving things of various times. In that sense, there are many archaeologies beyond the modernist one. In this vein, we can say that archaeology is about the relationship between materiality and temporality. If this is the case, then archaeology is not about ancient things or old things, but things in general, or rather assemblages, characterized by diverse temporalities. The present, thus, can be seen as archaeological as much as the Paleolithic. So, my project on Lesbos, on archaeological ethnography and contemporary migration, a few things about that. As I said, Lesbos has had a long history of migration, but it was placed at the center of attention, especially media attention, recently, since the summer of migration, so-called summer of migration in 2015, and the major Syrian exodus following the war in Syria in 2015 and 2016. Now, that moment has been called often in the media and elsewhere a migration crisis. But others have argued that, in fact, it is not a migration crisis. It is a reception crisis. It is a crisis of reception on the part of the global North. It signifies the inability of societies in the North to deal with their own past and also their own present. The migration from the global South, it is linked to wars, to poverty, to suppression of freedoms. But it's perhaps more appropriate to link it to the long histories of colonization, which include the neocolonial projects such as the war on terror and the so-called war on terror in the Middle East. In other words, we could say that it represents the return of the colonized. It makes colonialism present, palpable, alive again. So invoking Derrida here, we could say that it is about haunting. It is about perhaps also hauntologies, not just haunting, but also the ontology of the way of being, the ontology of haunting. In case you have watched this film, I don't know whether you have seen it. If not, I would highly recommend it. But if you watch it, you'll actually understand the point I'm making about migration as hauntology. It is built as a love story, but in fact, it's a story about migration as a ghost story, as the haunting presence of colonialism and of migrants today. So what are the main responses to this phenomenon? Well, first of all, the main response by states and also by suprastates organizations such as the European Union is securitization, is the building of walls, including the building of walls on the sea with the ships of Frontex, the border control agency of the European Union, signifying what the anthropologist Catherine Besteman has called the new global apartheid. It is also, the second response is that of humanitarian governmentality, of course. Major agencies, including the UNHCR, many big NGOs, perform that rituals, the rituals of humanitarianism, adopting the morality of humanitarianism, resulting very often in the victimization of the border crossers and their portrayal as people of concern, which is the official terminology used by camp authorities on Lesbos. Another response, however, and what I find more sympathy with is to see this as a phenomenon, as a movement in both senses of the word, a movement in terms of mobility, but also a movement in terms of social movement. Social movement actually reshapes our world. But it's also about globalization. It's about the so-called time-space compression, the idea that Kabul is walking distance to Germany. You can actually start walking from Kabul and get to Germany. And many people have attempted it and many people succeed doing so. In that phenomenon, thus, we could see several other related phenomena emerging. One is what Ruben Anderson has called the illegality INC, the industry of migration, another facet of what has been called disaster capitalism. And the second is this migration as a spectacle, the spectacularization of migration. What you see here is a graffiti from Lesbos, following the visit of Pope in 2016 on the island. Lesbos became a stage, a global stage, through which many major personalities, politicians, Hollywood personalities and others actually passed, deeming that island, as I said, a global stage. All these phenomena can be witnessed on Lesbos. But on this context, I decided to actually focus on two specific sites, which you can call them ethnographic or archaeological sites. One is the camp of Moria. You can see it here on the map, very close to the main town of Mytilene. And the second is the so-called Lives Cemetery on the north of Lesbos. Now, the camp of Moria has been a weird object, a weird kind of site to explore and investigate. You can see on those images from top left, it's prior life as a Greek conscript camp, and then to the right and then to the bottom, its development into a major site for migration, for detention, for registration, for the extraction of information for all migrants actually crossing to Lesbos. And here you can see it's the peak of its expansion, which actually reached 20,000 people. And then the big fire in September 2020, last September, you can see it here at the bottom left, which actually destroyed the whole camp. And here already to the top right, you can see its leveling, its erasure. Bulldozers have now erased most of it, so it's going to actually fade out of the shape of the earth. Here is the entrance of this camp. And here is the last photograph I took in October showing the ruined landscape of Moria. And the second, as I said, it's this context here, the context of the so-called Lives Cemetery. Now, this is a very weird locality. It has gained huge media attention. You can find it with thousands of photographs in all over the place in many media. And it is in fact a specimen that speaks to the need to collect all remnants of border crossing from the beaches and deposit them somewhere out of place. It speaks of an anxiety, the anxiety that these things pollute, the anxiety that these things, the material signifiers and traces of border crossing, are invaders themselves and need to be gathered somewhere out of sight. Paradoxically, however, this practice resulted in the visibility, the further visibility of this phenomenon. And it became, in fact, a heritage locale. When we were there doing work with graduate students, we could see visitors coming and taking photos. It became a dark heritage locale already in 2017. So, and you could see life vests, but also boats that people used to cross from Turkey to Lesbos. So we decided to do an archaeological survey of this locality, but also an excavation in a kind of very, very small part of this, to actually try and understand its specific materiality and its texture as an object. Some of the finds and some of the detailed things we've actually encountered. Now, I want to say one word on collection before we move into the issue of exhibition. Now, unlike other projects, such as, for example, the undocumented migration project in the Mexico-US border, we decided to collect very, very selectively. We've collected very, very few things because we felt that at that specific locality, that context, collecting was impossible, difficult, but also problematic. It was impossible because the sheer scale and the volume of material traces made collecting, if not difficult, impossible. If not impossible, sorry, difficult. But also we felt that these things on the ground, on Lesbos, perform various functions for various groups. As I said, there were already heritage spaces, some of them, some concentrations, and they were also active. They became the raw material in various upcycling projects. So for us, it felt problematic to actually start collecting on a large scale. But we did decide, nevertheless, to very selectively collect a very small number of materials to facilitate their journey, to allow them to continue traveling, to allow them to become communicative objects, to become affective and mnemonic objects that are going to continue their work and their action in other contexts, in this case, in the context of a US university. So to energize their archival significance as material witnesses in the face of erasure. I already mentioned that erasure and accelerated ruination is something that happens very, very fast on the island. And I'll return to that point later when we talk about the exhibition. So I mentioned the upcycling kind of significance in the projects of these things. You may know that this work by Aiwewi, which was actually staged on the concert hall in Berlin in 2016, used 14,000 life vests from that locality, the life vest cemetery from Lesbos. This is an example of kind of reuse of that material for artistic purposes. But here you have another kind of upcycling, which still goes on. It is the remaking of life vests into bags. Many border crossers are employed in this workshop and Solidarity workshop to actually do that kind of work, and they sell these things globally through their website. Interestingly, the work, this work by Aiwewi is called Safe Passage. Now, Safe Passage is also the motto that people who make this work on Lesbos use on the back. So if you buy them, you'll read that message. But it's a very, very different kind of upcycling. We can discuss which one is preferred in this case, if we wish to go into that. So transit matter. Now, as you know, exhibitions on migration are abandoned. There are many museums, many established museums for migration stage exhibitions, and we can actually categorize them into group them into three groups. First, the big exhibitions staged by major migration museums in the US, in other countries. The second is the artistic exhibitions by galleries and museums involving works of contemporary artists. Away was one, but there are several others, of course. And finally, museums and galleries staging exhibitions based on academic or research work or activist and research work. So I can bring as examples here the State of Exception, the work that was done by Jason De Leon and his group, which was staged at Parsons and many other localities in the US. His more recent exhibition called Hostile Terrain, which is a series of pop-up exhibitions in many different localities in US, but also in other countries. The exhibition on Calais and the camps on Calais that was staged in the Pitt Rivers Museum about 3 years ago. And of course, our exhibition at the Hafenreffer Museum of Anthropology at Brown. So a few words on the rationale and the concept. The idea of this exhibition was conceived in the context of teaching. I was teaching a course on migration at Brown, and I was using some of these objects I had gathered from Lesbos for teaching purposes and also as material for students to stage their own small-scale exhibitions. That's when the Hafenreffer asked me to do something bigger in their own space. The main intention was to move beyond the paradigms I mentioned, securitization, bordering, but also humanitarianism, and show at the same time the brutality of the border regime and the paradigm of governmentality and reasoning, move beyond those paradigms, but at the same time hint at the role of these kind of components of the assemblage of migration. Now, assemblage and assemblage thinking is one of the key concepts behind this exhibition, and I mean it in the Deleuzian sense of the term, as the articulation of heterogeneous components which co-function and coalesce to give rise to new emergencies. Sensorial assemblages of migration, thus, can be affective, mnemonic, archival, of course, and political at the same time. But above all, we wanted with this exhibition to foreground the agency of the people on the move, the reshaping of the border landscape. Now, we divided the exhibition into three main kind of components, three axes, if you wish. The first is border crossing itself. The second is the camp of Moria as a specific locality, as a key locality. And the third, we called it art making as world making. For the first theme, the theme of border crossing, we exhibited life vests, you can see them here, to show the diversity, to show them from up close, to allow people to be able to touch them, to be able to understand their texture, but also to show the diversity of them, given that through photography, they've seen only life vest as a mass of material with no sense of what they actually are in terms of their also itineraries. For example, here you can see live vests coming from different kind of contexts and different sources. So you can have ones that they were actually made like this one here or this one here, made in backstreet workshops in Turkey. And they are proclaimed to be Yamaha, but in fact, we have proven that they are not Yamaha. They are actually contrabat with questionable kind of buoyancy. So they were given to migrants for the crossing. You can see ones like this one here, which actually come from decommissioned ships or from ferries like the one next to it, like the one which is Karahasan here, ferries that on the Bosporus. You can actually see a live vest that belong to airlines like this one. You can see small pool toys like this one, swimming pool toys like this one. So that diversity is something that was important for us to show. And we also exhibited the inner tubes from motorbikes and cars, which are also very, very common in that border crossing landscape. But we also showed a series of small objects that they never actually make it in the news and the photography you see in photojournalism. So from the live cemetery, we collected a baby feeder bottle figure from Iraq, toothpaste from, I think, from Iraq as well, but also an anti-stress pill bottle made in Canada, and a set of gloves, American lime gloves, that actually found again on the beach and then on the secondary context of the live cemetery. So in this assemblage, you could see actually different actors in operation, not only the border crossers themselves, but also the groups of volunteers that were active on beaches to help people disembark and then get into the various services and ceremonies. And of course, that stressful, extremely stressful job of being there day and night is actually expressed in that very small object here, the anti-stress pills you can see on this slide. We also have a series of videos to evoke the soundscape of border crossing. Now, very quickly to move into the other two themes of the exhibition, so can allow us some time for discussion. As I said, Moria was a very key site for us to exhibit and to discuss. It was done through photography. So photography of two kinds, the photographs I have taken of the site, but also photographs that border crossers have taken themselves. So you could see, and also video here, you could see on this video, the soundscape of the camp at the peak of its major expansion, when it became, in fact, a camp city, not just a camp. I agonized a lot about photography, and I continue doing so when I'm in the field. It's extremely difficult to know what is appropriate to photograph. My guidance in relation to people has always been the dictum of my colleague at Brown, Ariella Zulai, which is the civil contract of photography, that you enter a contract with the people there when they want you to photograph them, but your side of the contract is to make that photo available to other people. So what you see here is border crossers from a South Asian country demonstrating. When they saw me, when I approached them, they raised their hands and their fists and they made the victory sign. They were staging a photo, and there is my side of the contract to make that photo visible to others outside. But I also wanted to have people who live there take their own photos. So I started the Polaroid Project. I gave this camera you can see here to people who lived inside the camp with the help of a small NGO. And they produced a series of very interesting small Polaroid photos that depict the claustrophobic nature, but also the dignity and the resilience of living in the camp of Moria. What we're trying to do with photography is what Rancière calls, rather rephrasing what Rancière has called distribution of the sensible. So we're trying to redistribute the sensible through this kind of photographic depiction of the camp. And finally, in the context of art, we wanted to show that people who live there actually are very active in producing their own arts. It's very easy to forget that the term migration does immense violence to people. It homogenizes people who come from diverse backgrounds, who have a range of skills and abilities, and they're very keen to continue performing them in the camp. So it was important for us to demonstrate that ability to convey things through many different ways, including art. So for example, we exhibited the work of a specific artist called Shukran Shizart, who comes from Afghanistan, and himself and his wife, Lida Shijar, have been painting since the moment they arrived at Moria or in Lesbos, painting many different facets, including the actual phenomenon of spectacularization of migration, of border crossing. So these are some of the paintings that we exhibited in the gallery. So very briefly, I want to end by discussing some of the issues that actually emerge in this work. What happens when these objects enter the museum space? Well, many things happen, and we're still exploring some of these things. First of all, trash, or what has been considered by many people, the majority of people on Lesbos, as pollution, as trash, becomes something else. It acquires value, epistemic value, we learn things, affective value, and mnemonic value. But other things happen as well. For example, when I took this photo in the last day when the gallery was open, just before the closing, and you could see the live vest from behind the gallery exhibiting Mesoamerican objects, originally from private collections and then donated to the Hanfer Museum. So what happens when these objects are entering the museum and are exhibited side by side with objects that come from different itineraries and through different routes? What happens when both of them can actually interact, converse, and engage us in the whole discussion of decolonizing the museum? What happens when we see the migration of objects and the migration of people together as one phenomenon or as a similar phenomenon? And I'm reminded here of a phrase that makes this connection direct, palpable, even haunting. Aminata Traoré, who was the former Culture and Tourist Minister of Mali, put it in a nutshell when she said, "Our cultural works enjoy civil rights in places where even our entire community is denied permission to stay." Now, I think we need to reflect on that specific saying. More importantly, however, we hoped, and we still hope, that these objects create a new space. They gather people around for reflection, debate, and even political organizing. We started doing so when the gallery was open, and we hope we're going to continue so next year. But there are dangers, of course. There are dangers of aestheticization, of museification. And I think we try to avoid these dangers as much as possible through a series of events we organized in the gallery, and through the notion that what we have done there is actually co-organized and co-shared and co-stewarded with many different organizations of border crossers and many of their own kind of teams they have actually established on Lesbos. And with that note, I would like to finish, and I would like to thank this organization actually helped us stage this, or rather collaborated with us to do so. Lesbos Solidarity, Way of Hope for the Future, Refocus Media Lab, and Archaeological. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Yannis. Thank you for this presentation. That was absolutely great. I invite our panelists to switch on their cameras so they're part of the panel and visible, and start also the audience which is not on the panel to start filling in questions through the chat or through the Q&A. But once you're doing this, I'll take the liberty of starting off with a question. And that has to do with something you sort of hint at in your book. Also, today you spoke about this a little bit, and it's to do, if we're moving back from the objects to the people and the inhabitants of the Moria camp. It has to do with their suspicion of being recorded and being made the subject of surveillance in that sense. And I guess in many cases they were suspicious about you doing the same thing. I was hoping to ask what your strategies were when you were asked to maybe explain your project, your interests to them. How did this happen?
Yes, I mean, as you hinted, Gaspar, this is a huge issue and something that bothers me, and I'm sure other colleagues who work on similar context all the time. In fact, the emphasis on things, on objects, on artifacts, helps in that sense. It actually, I found it extremely difficult to carry out the traditional, conventional kind of methodologies of ethnography in terms of engaging people in long conversations, in terms of kind of doing interviews and all that. And remember, these people are people who have been narrating the self all the time. They have to perform the self in front of border agencies, in front of asylum officials, in terms of also of other authorities. So very often they resent the fact that they have to continue doing so also in front of scholars or in front of researchers, especially when they know that their stories are not always valued or believed by many of the various authorities of the border regime. So an emphasis on the texture of their lives, an emphasis on their own material worlds is an indirect way to establish some sort of connection with them. I made it also very, very clear to them that for me, my presence there is not so much as the presence of a researcher as the presence of somebody who is in solidarity with them. So I think that political commitment needs to be made clear to them from the very beginning. And there have been various occasions when the act of keeping notes or recording or whatever is secondary or has been abandoned altogether in favor of engaging in an activity that is more of a kind of contributing to the efforts that they themselves are engaging with. So that's how I've tried to solve that dilemma. It's not easy, of course, all the time, and it takes effort. It takes kind of consistent presence there over the years, and I've been there twice a year since 2016. So it's not something you can do it as a kind of quick in and out project. That's not the kind of project that's neither ethical nor appropriate in that specific locality.
Yes, thank you. We have first questions coming in from for visitors who are not on the panel, but can I ask the panel first? Aaron, please.
Thank you, Yannis, for the talk. It was really interesting on so many levels. And I have two sort of specific questions. One of them was about when you mentioned the collecting, the relatively limited collecting you did. And I wondered, from whom did you collect those? I mean, what process of permissions, to whom do those things belong? Much that before they belonged to you and your team in the sort of process of archaeological collecting. So that's one question. And then my other question, I was so interested to hear your sort of setup of the project in terms of sort of thinking reflexively about archaeology. And I wondered how much of that kind of reflexivity was a part of the exhibition itself, or whether that was sort of your framing of it. And while you were speaking, I was sort of perusing the website and sort of comparing the installation images on the website with the way that the exhibited objects are then represented on the website. And one of the interesting discrepancies that I saw was, say, in the objects, some of the things that were collected, the everyday items that you showed in your PowerPoint, that in the exhibit they were sort of featured as exhibition objects with numbers keyed to a label, presumably. But on the website, they're featured individually with their archaeological scale in the photos, visible in the photos, that sort of archaeological apparatus. And I wondered whether any of that was also in the exhibit as installed. So there's sort of kind of two related questions in that way.
Thank you, Aaron. Both great questions, and we could say a lot about it. I will try and be brief. On the first one, I do not see myself as an owner of these things. I don't believe I own them. I see them myself as a temporary steward. And my idea is that these things will continue traveling, will continue being in circulation, in exhibitions beyond Providence in the future, and eventually they will they will end their lives. And I have actually resisted actively the efforts of the museum to arrest their biography and life by performing the rituals of conservation, for example. In terms of permissions and where did we collect these things? Most of the time we collect them from rubbish, from things, from dumps, basically. Very occasionally, for example, the works, of course, the paintings were paintings that the painter themselves donated to us for the purpose of the exhibition. But most of the time were things that they were scattered around. So there wasn't any sense of, needing to actually ask permission. I didn't collect things from Moria camp, for example. Most of the things were, as I said, from various dump locations. But it's an interesting issue in relation to what constitutes heritage and material objects in that context. They are not officially archaeological objects. They are not part of the official heritage legislation in the country. As I said, they're accidental heritage. When they become visible, like the Live Cemetery, and when the municipality of Lesbos, the previous municipality, decided that Lesbos should be declared the island of hospitality. So that artifact became then a symbol for the scale of the phenomenon that the municipality had to face with border crosses. But they were not official heritage. They're kind of temporary accidental monuments in many ways. Now, the second is a very, very interesting story. Yes, we tried to guide ourselves through the overall thinking of this project. That has not always been possible because we were actually confronted with a specific apparatus, which is the Ethnographic Museum, right? In terms of the transition from the actual exhibition to the online version, what happened, and in fact, I didn't realize until late, is that many of the documentation photos that the museum took for its own recording purposes became then photos that were exhibited, but they were not meant to be exhibited in the gallery. They are now exhibited accidentally again by contingency on the website. And it poses various questions there. Maybe it's not much of a problem. It actually allows us to have this kind of discussion now, but it shows how when you have different agencies and apparatuses and rationales and logics, you may have lots of, you may have various kind of, how can I say it, various developments that may not necessarily be part of the original rationale of this. I think.
We have one, yes, we have Meredith who contact me by chat.
Thanks so much, Casper, and thank you, Yannis, for this great talk. I have a question also about the collection process and thinking about how your collection process might have differed from a typical collection at an archaeological site where you might try to get a representative sample or a random sample of the kinds of objects from a certain area. And so I guess my question is, did you collect things from the Life Vest Cemetery in an attempt to get a representative sample, a random sample, or did you select things that spoke to you that seemed to be very evocative? And then if much of that collection happened before you had an exhibition in mind, did you collect additional things for the exhibition? And did the things that you chose to show in the exhibition connect to the ethnography that you had at the camp? So I guess it's about, my question is a big one, I guess, about collection at the site and then how that related to the objects you chose to show and to the ethnographies.
No, thank you, Meredith. It's a good question. And when we were doing this work at the Live Vest Cemetery, which was 2007, I had no idea that these things are going to be exhibited. There was no sense of exhibition there, but there was, I guess, a sense that some of these things could be re-energized in the context of teaching. That was at the back of my mind. In terms of the strategy, it was more of kind of a strategy of choosing things in a representative manner, to what extent these things are represented, but at the same time, the affective dimension was important as well. Certain things did speak to me and to us as a group then more than others. The diversity of life was something that was important for us to show, but at the same time, some of the small things I showed immediately kind of touched us in ways that we didn't anticipate. There were also other things that we chose not to collect because although they were extremely affective, they were too affective for it to be subjected to the process of collecting and for us to carry them to an American university. So there were certain things that would have been extremely powerful in an exhibition gallery, but it didn't feel ethical and appropriate for us to do so, to collect at that moment. So it was a complex process of kind of trying to balance the representation angle and the affective angle as well, and the ethical, of course, at the same time.
And can I follow up and ask if you recorded those objects you didn't collect? Did you make notes of them, or did you photograph them?
Yes, we did record them. We photographed them. But again, in terms of how do you share these photos, every time I do share photos from this context, I go on how to do it and which ones are appropriate to show. There is also, I've done work on other contexts, including on not a metaphorical cemetery, but a real cemetery of people who sadly perished in the process. So these are things, photographs from that context, I don't want to share for good reasons. So yes, there is some sort of photographic documentation, but doesn't mean that these photos can be freely shared with other audiences. Yeah.
I had almost simultaneous questions from Frida Papavasiliou and Fred Bohr. To be neutral, I will take them in alphabetical order. Fred Bohr first.
All right, thank you very much.
Hi, Fred.
Hi, Yannis. Thanks a lot for this talk. Thanks especially for, if I understood you right, a definition of archaeology that includes art history. A tangible discourse of the past that goes through tangible objects. I'm totally in favor of a capacious way of gathering together on this. So just following this up just for a second, in the kind of way that just makes sense to me, you said here, and I think you also said in your statement something about what you called the dangers of aestheticization and museumification and so on. Now, surely you didn't think these dangers were so great that you didn't do this exhibit. So I wonder how you negotiate around that and what that means. You can't get around museums without the aesthetic. And for that matter, you can't get around what you're doing per se without it either. I'm dazzled by that image of what to me, now that I'm working on monuments, was a spontaneous monument of the life vest cemetery with those transient aestheticizers taking photographs of it even while you're doing it. So I wonder what's on the good side and what's on the bad side of it. And I've just one suggestion. I wonder how you think about this. I know in connection with other aspects of refugee study, in particular with Calais, the term borderscape shows up a lot.
Sorry, which one?
Borderscape.
Oh, yeah.
So, just as Mike Davis talking about surveillance comes up with Scanscape in the 80s and 90s, museums as ways of seeing today embody, and maybe your exhibit embodies, some kind of sense of a borderscape and everything that is involved in it, seen through the many ways that it's seen. So I wonder first if you feel comfortable with that, and if that's part of the aesthetic that is really on production. The reception aesthetic, by the way, very much. I think it's also marvelous that reception is so important here, not just in the political way you mentioned, but literally in terms of the viewer and viewer's experience. So I wonder what you think about thinking of this as a borderscape and emergent still one involved in viewer and the audience and the beholders share as much as anything you've done and put in motion. And in connection with that, this show is called Transient Matter, right? Mm-hmm. And to me, it is redolent of object-oriented ontology. And it particularly reminds me of Jane Bennett's book, Vibrant Matter, which has many of the same things going on with it. But I wonder how you feel about that, and if either of those connect with what you had in mind.
Yeah, well, great. Thank you very much, Fred. Lots of interesting ideas here. First of all, on the notion of the aesthetic. Well, yes, I mean, we could have a long discussion about, first of all, the definition of the aesthetic, to what extent we talk about the Kantian version, to what extent we talk about aesthetics as sensoriality. What I meant by, when I mentioned the danger, was more to do with the idea that sometimes we see in exhibitions, especially exhibitions of migration to do with contemporary art projects, when things become objects for abstract, perhaps, contemplation, or for things become, beautiful in the kind of, to use a very, very, blunt term. We wanted for these things to have an affective impact, so in that sense to be aesthetic in terms of sensoriality, but at the same time we did not want them to become a typical museum object. So casing is something we agonized a lot about, to what extent and which ones are going to be included in glass cases, which ones are not going to be. A compromise had to be reached about it. Some of the glass cases could not be moved of that space, so they were used, but at the end it did not make a huge it wasn't a huge problem. Museification is probably another term, but museification is more is easier to deal with, because museification, for example, is for them to start being conserved and preserved and be subjected to all these protocols of a museum, and that we wanted to avoid, and I think we have avoided to a large extent. Now, some of the criticism of this exhibition by colleagues, including by my colleague Ariella Azoulay, was that the scale of the photos was not the right one. The scale of my own photos. Ariella thought they were huge, they were too big for that space, and in fact worked against the idea that I was trying to convey. So it's something I've been thinking a lot about, and maybe she was right, but something I want to continue exploring. Now, the juxtaposition of my own photos with the small Polaroids of the people who lived on the camp, I felt it was important, and I felt that it did go to some way to avoiding some of these kind of issues we've been discussing about. In terms of your other ideas, I entirely agree. I think it's great to think about it in terms of borderscapes. I had in mind describing the context of Lesbos as a borderscape, but I think you could say that the museum itself becomes a borderscape. And I think my last photo of photographing the live vest through the glass with the Mesoamerican objects is perhaps more, speaks to your point about borderscapes in the museum.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Have quarter past, which means that some of our colleagues and students will have to leave because they have teaching in the afternoon. But we intend to go on until past, and we have one more question from the panel, and then I'll move over to questions from the chat. Please, Phaedra Papavasiliou, you had a question before.
Hi, and thank you so much. Wonderful as always. My question is potentially irrelevant, but sort of in the same vein. So I was wondering to what extent the concept of the relic might come to play in this kind of work and in this context. And I'm asking because you're talking about kind of sort of like queering the notion of the border and time and archaeology and all this kind of stuff. And so the relationship between kind of what is the physical body and what is like a material object can be seen as a little bit blurry, especially given the deeply intimate nature of so many of the things that are being displayed. And by the kind of display of these very intimate objects, you stated that you want to kind of highlight the dignity within the hardship as well as the agency. So is there anything there? Is there any relevance to the concept of the relic? And where do you think that might also play a role later in the lives of these exhibitions and this work?
Thank you, Fedra. I haven't thought of using the concept of the relic because we related to different kind of frames of thinking and different contexts as well. But maybe you're right. Maybe it is something that actually could be used. I think what you said in relation to the blurred nature between object and person, or object and body, is something that we've been thinking a lot about in relation to the live vests themselves. Because that's the obvious case when you have an object in the shape of a torso, in the shape of a human being as well. At the same time, it evokes the absence of the human being, in which case, in some cases, could also be a real tragic absence of somebody who did not actually make it in the crossing, a void. So you could actually think that live vests represent the typical kind of definition of the uncanny as a doubling, as something that is both thing and a being, present and absent at the same time. So there is a lot there to think about, but yeah, relics is something I need to think more about. By the way, what happens with the other context, the context of Moria, is also extremely important because it was a ruin for a short period of time. You know, it was destroyed by fire in September. And I was there in October. I was able to do a photographic recording of it. And now people tell me from the island that it has been completely erased. So it didn't stay to become its time of agony, to use the expression that my colleague Alfredo Ribal uses, was a very, very short one. But also that raises issues of erasure, memory, and what happens to all these things we have recorded, photographic and other, of that context that the authorities want clearly to forget for obvious reasons. It has been declared the worst camp in the world. It has been declared, all sorts of things. So that's another issue to consider, the relics of Moria and how fast or disappeared. Although I suspect if I go there now, I may be able to find some small things because, as we know, materiality endures. And even when they think they have destroyed everything, there are still things to be found.
And this brings us to a good link to the next question from the audience. This one is from Robert Preusel. Thank you so much for such a wonderful talk. Can you share with us the current status of the people that live in the Moria camp? Where were they relocated? Is your exhibit of Moria now shifting to the commemoration and memorialization?
Okay, thank you, Bob. And as, of course, many of you will know that Bob Roussel, my colleague at Brown, is also the director of the HaFeRefer. So I'm grateful to him and his staff for helping and making this exhibition possible. Now, what happened to the people was that they were relocated into another camp, close to, not far from the old Moria, a camp that was projected and portrayed in the media and by the authorities as a very different one that doesn't have the problems that Moria has. But in fact, border crossers, asylum seekers, already call it Moria 2. And by talking to them, they tell me that, in fact, it is worse than Moria 1. And it is worse because this locality used to be a fire range of the Greek army. So it's a kind of a barren landscape. It doesn't have the resources, the hinterland, the landscape that Moria had. People were using olive trees, they were using things they could find in the surrounding areas, surrounding fields of the old Moria for firewood, for building their houses, their shelters, for food as well. Now they cannot do that now. They are in a very tightly controlled, guarded, and sanitized environment. And because of COVID, or with the pretext of COVID, they cannot move around, and they're allowed to be out only for shopping once or twice a week. So the relocation, in fact, made their life worse compared to what it was before. Now, in terms of what happens to the record, as I said, this is something that we are still, and I'm still thinking about. I hope that it's not just a project of memorialization, that is going to be something that will continue being part of the discussion for some time to come, because, you know, Moria 1 and Moria 2 are different things, but the conditions, as I said, are very similar or worse in the second one. So the issues are still there.
Thank you. And we have a question from Elizabeth Green.
Thank you so much, Yannis, for this talk. It was so great to hear your work in person and to see all of the images in the exhibit, which I wish I could have seen in person. I have a question. I hope so. I can't leave Canada at the moment, but I hope to see it. Everyone's been asking these big questions, and I have a couple of smaller ones, I guess, that are based on specific materialities. In the beginning of your talk, you mentioned the cell phone as the hyper object of migration today. And it seems so striking to me that with this object of the cell phone, it's something that we can't record archaeologically, nor can we record the memories and the materialities that are preserved through this vehicle that becomes as transitory and as transient as the people who carry it. And so on the one hand, I'm curious about how archaeologists can grapple with, on some levels, the lost materialities of the things that, if we imagine what did migrants carry as a question from the ancient past, that's no longer the case, because so many of those things are now the things that are carried in the vehicle of the cell phone. And so on the one hand, we have the thing that the cell phone that, you know, records objects that we don't have materially anymore. On the other hand, from the archaeological perspective, we have the answers that archaeologists can perhaps bring visibility to that ethnography can't. And here again, I'm thinking about your fake life jackets and these objects where, you know, because you can analyze the foam or the writing or the brands on the life jackets, that they didn't float as well, but hopefully, in person, the people moving did not have to find that out. So I'm wondering, sort of from the perspective of archaeology, where you see archaeology making a contribution, where you see it unable to make a contribution here, and how that kind of fits into this broader concept of objects that are moving and that we can put into an exhibit in a way that people are still limited from that. Sorry for it became a very big question, but really I'm thinking about the smaller materialities.
Thank you, Liz. That's very, very interesting. I mean, in terms of the mobile phone, I talked about condensed materiality because, as you say, with that very same object, you have very different functions being performed. So it's, you know, it's the carrier of memories. It's also a key tool for communication, a key tool for conduct, a key tool of reporting as well. And because something we forget about, because we are used to so much for the journalism and journalism general reporting on migration. In fact, very, very often, many of my interlocutors and others do their own reporting of the conditions in the camp and the conditions in border crossing. Routinely, when they do the crossing, they also communicate with NGOs to give their specific stigma in the sea and to ask for help. So for them, that little object is extremely, extremely important. Now, as you say, we may not be able to have it physically because of its nature, but we have its traces. We have its traces online. We have its traces in terms of the photos that have been circulated. We have its traces in terms of the videos that have been uploaded on YouTube and on many other channels and platforms. So I think we do have sort of material remnants of that activity, of the importance of the live vest. In terms of how we can contribute. I mean, as you said, we can contribute in terms of the detailed attention we paid to things and to objects, not just photograph a live vest, but also tear it apart and examine its interiors and examine the form, examine the little kind of tag and realize, where it was made and how it was made. We can also spend time analyzing materially the apparatus of detention, because that's the other side we rarely do, or photojournalists rarely do, how these buildings function in terms of regulating people's bodily lives and conduct on the camp. Funnily enough, the camp of Moria spoke to me, especially the interior or the walled compound, when it became a ruin. Why? Because I had full access to the parts inside that I was not allowed to go in before. And I was able to examine in detail, for example, the asylum building. I was able to examine the building of some sort of kind of cordon sanitaire, kind of double wire fencing. I was able to see how people had to push their papers through a hole to actually give it to the asylum seeker officials. So these things, the emphasis we give on that texture and detail of the material is something we can contribute a lot through. We cannot contribute much in terms of conventional archaeology, like excavation, for example, because as we said, there are various issues, some of them practical, the sheer scale of it, but also issues like the quick erasure of these things, the fact that ruination and erasure happen so fast in this context that you don't have enough time to actually do these things. For example, after my visit to Moria in October, I made a request to the Ministry of Migration to go back with the team and do a proper recording of the camp. It took them 3 months to respond to me. They said, yes, go ahead. But by that time, the bulldozers were already there and kind of had erased most of it. As I said, I'll go nevertheless, but I won't be able to do that recording that I had planned. So we cannot keep up in terms of kind of the rate of accelerated ruination we see in this context.
Thank you. We are almost half past, and we have maybe one very brief question from our colleague Ivan Gaskell, who would love to hear your thoughts on the Christoph Büchel Barca Nostra, the Venice Biennale, if you have seen that in 2019.
In the Venice, which specific work?
The Barca Nostra by Christoph Büchel.
Is this the board, right?
That's right, yes.
Yeah. I had seen it. I recall at the time that I hadn't seen it in person, but I had seen photographs of it. And I recall at the time the extensive debate and discussion in the media about that specific object and to what extent it was appropriate for it to be exhibited in the Biennale. I'm ambivalent about it. I have seen similar works on Lesbos. I mentioned Awewe as the key artist who spent time in 2016 with the whole team, in fact, on Lesbos. And I recall again that some of it was controversial. For example, the remaking of his photograph of Alan Kurdi, the Syrian boy. So I would say that some of the artistic work that was done in relation to migration is more successful than other work. But as somebody who works so closely with artists in the camps, I would rather emphasize their own attempt at expression, artistic expression, than the attempt of a major artist. That's not to denigrate major artists in the world, but I think at this specific moment, it's important to show that even after Awewe left Lesbos, there are people who are behind. There are people who are doing upcycling of that material all the time for their own livelihood as well as for their own artistic expression. And that's important to be emphasized. So I'm sorry I don't have more to say on that work because I haven't seen it in person myself, so I don't feel comfortable in expressing an opinion.
I have to unfortunately kind of push it to a close because it is half past. One brief question: how long is the exhibition on for? You might have said it, I might have missed it.
Well, it's as I said, we are hoping that the gallery is going to open properly and physically in the next academic year,
Right.
and it's going to be on for the full academic year. I think it's going to be on until December next year. So you have more than a year to actually come and see it. So
another reason to look forward to travel, hopefully resuming very, very soon post-COVID. Thank you very much, Yannis. This was really a great presentation. I very much enjoyed this, and we had a great discussion. I'm very sorry that we have to close it so soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I enjoyed it.